Well, hello, you wonderful, amazing people. Welcome back to The Unseen. If you follow this series at all, it's obvious I am not in my normal place. I am recording at work today instead of at home. Just some schedule stuff going on. So I'm recording here at work. Not that it really matters, but there you go. If you're wondering what's different, I'm in my office instead of home. Okay, so last week we talked, just to give you a quick recap, we're in the Daniel series, and last week we talked about Daniel chapter 6, and that's the whole part where Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den, and, we know the story. If you want to get a recap, or want to go into that story, watch last week's video. So that's where we were. So now we're on Daniel chapter 7. This one is really cool. I like this chapter a lot. And actually the next few are probably from Daniel chapter 7 on to the end are probably my favorite chapters in the book. And so there's a few things I want to mention one thing I want to mention specifically, and then one other thing that I kind of want to focus on. So, quick little note, this isn't important for, the whole thing of what we're talking about, but it's not chronological. So in Daniel chapter 6, in Daniel 5, we see the end of the Babylonian kingdom, and that's where the Persians come and take over. And so Daniel chapter 6 is Daniel in Persia with King Darius. But now in Daniel chapter 7, and I believe again in 8, we're back in Babylon. So it reverts in time a little bit. It's just not in chronological order. So just a side note, if you're reading and wonder why things seem weird, the book is not written like a chronological story. Okay. So Daniel has these dreams and visions. That's what the whole chapter is. And you'll read it. It's going to sound familiar. And not going to go into that. So I'm not going into what all the parts of the dreams are. But I do want to make this note because we've talked about dreams a number of times. And I don't know that I've ever noticed this before, but in verse 1 of chapter 7, he says this. He says, I'll just read it. So in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Weird way to say it. He had dreams and visions. And then this is the interesting part. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. So he summarized what it was. So we've talked about this a few times now. Dreams are important. Dreams and visions, they're important. And what did Daniel do right there? He wrote them down. Writing them down is important. And I've encouraged you many times, if you want to grow in dreams, your ability to interpret and to just grow in that area, if you're hungry for dreams, to grow in that spiritual language, because I do believe dreams are highly spiritual. It's not just something our brain does when our eyes are closed and we, flip on to standby mode for sleeping time. We can have, I think there are dreams that are kind of like that, but I also think dreams are deeply spiritual and that God gives us dreams all the time. And I think you can actually grow in that and you can mature in that. And as you pursue that and walk that out, I think you can have an increase. So write them down. So that's the thing I wanted to mention. And now I want to talk about the main part that I want to highlight. So let's do it. All right. So he has the whole thing and he starts describing what's going on. I'm not going to go into that, but it is interesting. It talks about the beast coming out of the water and all these different things of what it's talking about. I don't want to talk about that right now. So if you want to study into that, feel free. It is interesting. It's very cool. But that's not what I want to focus on. What I want to focus on is something that I think is easily not noticed. So I'm just going to give you like a quick little background. I don't know how I want to put this exactly, but I'll try. So Jesus, before he was born to Mary, was not Jesus. So maybe that's very obvious to you. Maybe you've thought about that. But I remember it wasn't too long ago that revelation, if you want to call it that, kind of struck me. And it seemed so obvious, but it kind of blew my mind. He was not always Jesus. So we consider, and there's another part of when we get further in Daniel that this will come up. So I don't want to ruin that, spoil it. But Jesus wasn't always Jesus. Now, he was always the Word. And you see in John 1:1 where it says the Word, he was in the beginning. Beginning was the Word and all that. So he's eternal. He was always there, but he wasn't always Jesus. So Jesus was a name given to him when he was born. And once he died, rose again, and then was ascended, then he gets like this new status. So though he was always God, he was the Son, he actually was exalted. He was elevated. Promoted probably isn't the right word, but it kind of fits. Because then it says, and I didn't look this up ahead of time. It's probably in a few spots, so forgive me. I think it's in Ephesians. There might be a couple other spots it's in, but or at least different references to it, but whatever. I'll just paraphrase. You can look it up. Where he was given the name above every name. All authority was given to Jesus and all that. So those things he did not always have because it was given to him after. So it's just an interesting side note to consider, and that's where we're going to go to in Daniel 7 that I want to bring up, is that Jesus wasn't always Jesus. He was not called that before he was born to Mary. And so he had lots of other names. So there was like the creator God, we call the Father now, but in the Old Testament, he's not generally called the Father, maybe at all, I'm not sure. But the whole Father and Son thing wasn't really seen until later. And previous to that, there were lots of other names. You've heard many of them, but unless you do a lot of study or have had a lot of teaching in this, you don't always know where it comes from. So one of the names of God that most of us are probably somewhat familiar with is, sorry, I had a notification, is Ancient of Days. So maybe you've heard that name for God, the Ancient of Days. There was an old song, it's like an old school church song, not like a hymnal necessarily, though there might be a hymn with that in it. But there was a song, I'm not going to sing it, but it had the Ancient of Days in it, and that was kind of one of the main parts. So if you've heard that and you've ever wondered, and maybe you didn't know where it came from, the only place in the Bible that has that name for God, the Ancient of Days, is in Daniel chapter 7. So there's at least one other spot in the Bible that has the phrase Ancient of Days attached to God. But in Daniel chapter 7, it happens 3 times. And in Daniel chapter 7 is the only chapter in the whole Bible that uses Ancient of Days as a title for God. Interesting. It doesn't make it less legitimate, but it's just an interesting side note. So if you ever wonder where that came from, because it's not like you read the Gospels or read the New Testament and you see that anywhere, but Ancient of Days specifically, Daniel chapter 7. So we get a name for God right there in Daniel 7, Ancient of Days. So this would be like God the Father. It's generally talked about, at least. That would be who we would call the Father. This is the Ancient of Days. And we actually see, and this doesn't happen too often in the Bible, but we see it specifically here. It does happen in other places. It's just you don't see it all the time. So it's worth noting that here in, it mentions Ancient of Days in verse 9. And then when you go down to verse 13 and 14, you actually see a interaction between the Ancient of Days, the Father, between what Daniel calls the Son of Man. So this is Jesus And every time you see Son of Man, it doesn't mean Jesus. But in this case, when you read it out, you'll see that this is talking about Jesus. So you actually see an interaction between the Son and the Father all the way back here in Daniel, which was well before Jesus shows up, when he's born on the earth and all that. So I actually want to read this because it's very interesting. It'll sound familiar, kind of like it has some correlation, though not directly, with Book of Revelation and maybe a couple other spots. But so verse 13 and 14. So I'm going to read this out and then kind of give you an assignment if you want to practice some stuff. So verse 13, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days. And they brought him near before him. So right there you have the capital H, him, which I know why we do. It just helps us know who it's talking about. But it's basically like it's him before him. So like God came before himself, but it's the Father and Son. And that's why it's a little interesting. You don't see that very often where there's that interaction, like we're actually witnessing an interaction between God and God. You see that when Jesus is baptized, and there's other spots, but just interesting. And there was given him dominion, verse 14. There was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom. So it sounds a little bit like parts of Revelation. That all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion, so this is saying what the Ancient of Days is giving the Son of Man, Jesus, who isn't called Jesus yet. That all people, nations, and languages should serve him. So that should sound like this, that every knee should bow and every tongue confess that he is Lord, right? His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. So right here we're seeing that like the Ancient of Days is giving the Son of Man this kingdom that will be everlasting. There's lots of other references that might be, if you're really familiar with Scripture, references that would be popping up. So here's what I want to draw a picture of. The significance of this moment, because and I'm not going to talk about this either. In verse 16, you see it. The assumption would be, though I guess we don't know this for sure, but in verse 16, Daniel asks someone who's with him the interpretation of all this stuff that he's seeing, and the only probable explanation to this is an angel with him. So anyway, he asked an angel to interpret stuff for him. So Daniel is witnessing on this dream and vision this whole thing of these other beasts coming out of the water, with the culmination of it all, with the Ancient of Days giving this everlasting kingdom and dominion and rule and power and all that and glory to the Son of Man, the Son. So Jesus. So he sees this long before it ever happens, and he sees all of this stuff happening, kind of the process of like these other kingdoms coming and rising and all that stuff. So he's troubled. Like this actually deeply, it says in verse 15, Daniel was grieved in his spirit. So you would think, wow, that's amazing. But it was so troubling. So I want to give you an assignment and then talk about why I think it's a little significant. This is like such a powerful scene right here. I would encourage you to read the whole chapter even a couple times, but then read specifically verses 13 and 14 and read those two verses and then practice some meditation on it. Meditate on those verses. And it's an imagination exercise. So read those verses 13 and 14 and then imagine that moment where Daniel is seeing. So like, go from the perspective of Daniel maybe, and imagine seeing and witnessing the moment that the Father is giving the Son the kingdom of heaven, everything, all dominion, all glory, and So he's giving him this everlasting kingdom. So imagine that moment and practice that. It's a powerful, powerful scene. And here's why I think it's so significant and why Daniel was so troubled. Because you would think, why would he be so grieved and bothered? This is a good thing, right? It is. Now we know it is. But think about it from Daniel's perspective, that he has even been a part of multiple kingdoms now. He was with Babylon. He's a Jew from Israel. And then he was taken to Babylon and then to Persia and then another one. We'll get to that later in further chapters. But in this point, humanity is familiar with kingdoms rising and kingdoms falling. And the way humans are, like we build and then there's destruction and just kind of the cycle of the way of life. But he's witnessing this moment where the creator of the universe, all of creation, is giving the Son of Man an everlasting kingdom. That it says an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. So in this moment, here's why I think this is so powerful, is Daniel himself is having this dream and vision while he's in another kingdom, serving another king that is not his own. And he is witnessing, I guess you could say prophetically, like something that is going to happen. He's witnessing the moment where God, the creator, is about to shift the order of things. That all of creation and the way things had been set and been operating up until the moment that this happens, he sees the moment that something is going to change. And it's not a small thing. This isn't just like a prophetic message of how awesome Jesus is going to be. This is literally a moment that is prophesying to the future of what God is doing that shifts, completely shifts at its very core and foundation, the order of things. From that moment on, when this happens with Jesus and the Father, when it does end up happening, this is the moment that everything shifts. And we've had teachings on this, I know, so I'm not going to go into all that. But I think this just adds to the gravity and even the intensity of having the revelation of what happened when the Father gave the Son the kingdom. So meditate on that, meditate on those verses. It's powerful. And yeah, so that's it for Daniel 7. Those things just kind of struck me a lot, and just a couple other interesting details that I brought up in that. Or at least I think they're interesting. But meditate on those things. It is powerful. And I will see you next week for probably Daniel chapter 8, because that comes after 7. All right, bye.